Welcome everybody to our our last monthly on Mondays for 2024. We are very excited that you are all able to join. And if you're not able to join or you really enjoy, please do share with your colleagues the recording and with your department and division as well. Today we have a really special topic, which I think is near and dear to everybody. Because this is part of, I think, life that we deal with either with personally, family, and then this is going to be mainly focused on work. But I think a lot of the frameworks and tips that are probably going to be discussed today, we can use in all arenas of our life. Today, we have two wonderful speakers who are going to join us in our conversation today on negotiations. We have Dr. Nasia Safdar from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. She is the Dr. Dennis G. Mackey Endowed Faculty Fellow in the Division of Infectious Diseases, and she's Associate Dean for Clinical Trials at that university. She also has affiliate appointments in the Department of Medicine's Division of Geriatrics, Department of Population Health, and the Engineering Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering. She does lead the department in its mission to reduce healthcare-associated infections by identifying, testing, and implementing novel interventions. And she has received the President's Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the highest honor bestowed by the U.S. government on outstanding scientists and engineers beginning their independent careers. And so we are very excited to have her here today. We also have another speaker. When she arrives, I will introduce her. But I thought we would just start the conversation with Dr. Safdar. And we have some questions that we have prepared for her, but also if any of you would like to either raise your hand and ask a question or put it in the chat, I can ask it as well. So Dr. Safdar, I'm going to start it out with just asking a very simple question about negotiations is, what type of framework do you recommend when doing negotiations?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I think obviously, in the literature, there are a number of frameworks that one could use, and all of them have pros and cons. I use a couple of approaches. One is, which is a combination of different frameworks, and one is to go in with the right mindset, which is probably about 90% of the work, is to not dread it and to welcome it and to embrace it. Sometimes for people, this requires a bit of pre-work before you go in. But that to me is the most critical thing. And then when you shift that mindset or when you go in with that view, then it's really about how can everybody be successful? Whoever's at the table, how can we all be successful? And less about this is what I want and how can I get that? So same end game, you still want something and you'll get it, but it's just about how you frame it. So that has been helpful to me, at least, in thinking about it.
And do you use, how do you mentally prepare to get yourself in that mindset?
Well, so, you know, what people recommend, and some of these things I've tried, is that you take little steps at a time. So, for instance, if you're going to go in with a big negotiation ask in a few months, you might want to start practicing by asking for little things from people whom you don't know and you're not certain whether they will give you what you want. It could be as simple as asking somebody for, like if you're on a flight, this is a very simple example, but it actually does work. Like if you're on a flight and they ask you if you want crackers or cookies and you say, can I have both? So this is, and what will they do? I mean, the worst is they'll say no, but the stakes are very low. But what it does is it gets you used to hearing no. And when you get yes, it's a very pleasant surprise. And the stakes are so low that all the adrenaline rush is contained so that by the time you go in for the actual thing, you're like, well, what's the worst that can happen? Not much, probably, right? So depending upon what the ask is. A lot of what happens in negotiation in the beginning is a fight or flight response.
Mm-hmm.
And what you want to do is sort of just disarm that. Because once that happens and you aren't listening and you're just thinking about, well, what can I say next to get my point across? And that puts you at a little bit of a disadvantage. So my strategies are to practice on small stakes as many times as you possibly can. I do like the idea of role playing, but it's mostly about not necessarily to get to where you think you want to get to at the end, but mostly about conquering your body language and
Mm-hmm.
your demeanor and your facial expression. And whoever's in the role play with you can watch and see how you change when something is said that maybe you weren't expecting or didn't like. You want to be as neutral as possible in these situations, but that often takes practice. And since we can't see our own faces, we don't really know what we're looking like in the moment. So I do that for that purpose.
Do you use the Amy Cuddy superwoman pose as a just a way to get pumped up for a big negotiation?
I think people have said that it helps them. I think there's a few studies that showed that maybe it wasn't as powerful as one would like. But I
Hmm.
think something that is a somatic practice is very helpful, whether it's adopting that superpower pose, or it's taking a few deep breaths, or it's just like hunching your shoulders and like releasing your breath in a rush. Anything that will loosen the tightness in your body, because sometimes that's how stress will manifest itself. So any number of things can work. I like to do the box breathing
Hmm.
before I go in, and that usually helps calm me down.
I love that. So obviously for faculty, one of the big things for negotiation is compensation. So what is your approach for faculty, for yourself when discussing and negotiating compensation topics? How do you give a framework to approach that?
So I typically use two different things depending upon if this is the first time that you're negotiating it as a new faculty member, your first big job, so to speak, or if you're negotiating something for a raise, you're already in the position and they know they have you. So
Hmm.
the stakes are a little bit different in that context. But the idea essentially is the same, which is that before you go in with what you want to find out from them what is their philosophy for compensation? What are the things that they value? And how do they determine how compensation is achieved at a certain, what benchmarks do they use? What's the environment like for recent hires? And these are all entirely reasonable questions that can all be very hypothetical before you even say anything about what you are looking for and what you think is fair or just in that position.
Hmm.
That sort of goes along with the lines of, not being not necessarily even adversarial, but not going in right away with what you can take necessarily, but having the understanding of, and then that will tell you, well, depending upon their philosophy, these are the things that are reasonable for me to go after. And these are other things that maybe, in the next conversation, I could say something about.
Hmm. Do you have recommendations on like, for like in School of Medicines, there are different benchmarks. Like what recommendations do you have like where people can find some of this information about their own compensation before going into this meeting with the potential chief or chair?
Yeah, I think a lot depends on the position in question. So, for instance, if you're a clinical faculty member, then people use either MGMA benchmarks or they'll use AAMC benchmarks. And often, depending upon your specialty, the two can be very different. And
Hmm.
you want to find out where in those benchmarks is it the median that people are aiming for in that institution? And how does the ladder look like? What happens 5 years when you showed that you're amazing and what could happen to your career at that point? So those are some. Glassdoor, I have found to be, I try to gather as much information as I can. So Glassdoor is a possibility. I sometimes find that they really underestimate what physicians should be prepared to ask for. So, but it's just, one data point. And
Hmm.
then it also helps to ask as many other people, sometimes from outside your institution, about what are the things what sort of benchmarks are being used. Um, an example of how things can disadvantage you later on is if you had a certain compensation that you were given, and then you decide you want to buy out some of your clinical time. Now,
Hmm.
depending upon how much time that clinical time is worth, you could be looking at potentially a pay decrease if you choose to do education instead of seeing patients, which
Hmm.
is just terribly unfair and not at all the way that it should be. But the first time I learned of it, it took me by surprise because to me, if all the missions are equal, then how could this be? But because the benchmarks are different oftentimes. So just being aware and then you could decide what speaks to you. But
Okay.
those are some of the data points that I typically use. If it's a federal place, then there's federal salary tables that people should be looking at. So if you a dual appointment, for instance, at a VA or something like I do
Hmm.
look at those salary tables. And that's just that's something to get an idea about. Many of us, when we sort of evolve in our career, we might have a position that isn't easily found elsewhere
Hmm.
because you've started doing so many different things. So, for instance, for me, for this Associate Dean Clinical Trials, it wasn't really a great benchmark. The Associate Dean for Clinical Research was probably the closest that I could get to.
Hmm.
So, that's why I think talking to other people in that position like that and asking them how I find that people are now more willing to share that information than maybe they used to be. And then really remembering that you don't have to disclose what you're currently making, even if they ask. And
Hmm.
many people do ask in various ways. This is obviously most helpful if you're applying for a job elsewhere because they won't necessarily know. But one way or the other, people will ask, and then that's an anchor that you don't want them to have.
Hmm.
So you could say, that's not really information that I'm allowed to share or that people can ask about or something like that.
Okay. Other than compensation, what are other things that academic faculty can negotiate?
Just about everything, just about everything. You would be surprised. And I would recommend not limiting yourself to what you think you can negotiate for, because there are probably things that we're not even aware of that people are asking for and getting. The main thing to see when you do your discovery of what that institution is all about and what's important to them is there are some things that simply cannot be negotiated because it's policy, or if they did it for you, they would have to do it for a lot of other people. So it would be of no interest to them. Those are the things you want to find out about. What is likely to be a hard no? But though very few things are like that. Retirement plans, for instance, could be like that sometimes, but otherwise, very few things are. And
Mhm.
so, um, asking for things that you even think might not be possible is never a bad idea. But just realize that, what are the things that are must-haves for you, and what are the things that are maybe not now, but in the future, and what are the things that if you didn't get, you would be like, I just can't do this. I find this hard for people sometimes, but you do have to be prepared to walk away if there's something that's so in conflict with what you believe should have been part of the package.
And you mentioned that you can almost negotiate for anything. Can you give some like specific examples, like for clinical faculty and then those who are doing research, so they have some other specific ideas?
So for research faculty, for instance, and again, these are a lot of things that I learned through trial and error, which you want to kick yourself when you find out. But some of the things that from the research viewpoint is how indirects are dispensed to you. Right? So most of the indirects that you bring in from your grants go to your institution, and you might get a little bit back in the form of capital exercise with the funds at the end of the year. Most institutions have something like that. But you can also negotiate to have most of your indirects returned wholly to you without going through the rest of the institution. And that's not only the case if you have a center or if you have a very large grant. It could be anything that's, prestigious, that's hard to get. And if you get it, then you can negotiate that.
Mhm.
So that's a clear example of something. Obviously, startup funds. I think new faculty often underestimate what it will take to get a lab up and running or a clinical group up and running. So that's where you want to ask many other people in your area or your discipline what startups look like, and then aim for the higher end of that range.
Mhm.
Typically, I don't think people have trouble justifying that, which is the other important point. Obviously, whatever you ask for, you want to be able to justify it very clearly and very carefully.
Mhm.
And the more specific you can be in that justification, the better it is. Other things that you can negotiate is large purchases where you go in with another group to share. So,
Mhm.
for instance, you don't want to use your startup on a large piece of equipment, but you know of two other PIs who could use it too. Department chairs, deans love that when existing things can be leveraged for more than one PI. So, forming a coalition will often get you more than going in as a single person. So that's just a few examples. I mean, there are other things that, in the course of your career, when people ask you to do, you could be ready with what you think you need, and you could say, I'd love to do that, but here's what I would have to not do. And then that's the thing you least like to do. And then people are generally willing to at least consider it. Um, Sometimes what happens is that when we ask for these things and the answer is no, we get so discouraged that we don't bring it up again. And then the other party will be surprised because they're like, well, you've already given up just because I said no. So you have to remember to keep bringing it up in different venues, not in an annoying manner, of course, but just, I understand the answer is no right now. When would be a good time to rediscuss it? And what would you need to see from me to make you
Mhm.
want to talk about it? And that takes the pressure off of the other person. Um,
Mhm.
and, you want to have a good relationship with them and you're still working there, so you can always find them again and
What's
rediscuss.
one of the most unprecedented things that you've heard that someone has negotiated for? Or that was sort of like, you're like, wow, they really asked for that. Is there anything that you have come across in your career like that?
I think discretionary funding is one which is so nebulous because it is entirely discretionary. It works often for research, but you think you're asking for something that in your mind is a rather astronomical amount. And
Mhm.
then you find that somebody else at your own very similar career stage was able to justify a lot higher than that. That's where the anchoring becomes a problem. Because if somebody says to you, we're willing to give, say, 300,000 a year in discretionary funds for you, and that's just a huge amount for us, we wouldn't do it for anyone but you. Well,
Mhm.
now that in your mind, that's like, oh, that's an amazing amount of money until you find out that somebody else got 600,000. So of course it's about what you can justify, but that's the thing with discretionary funding is that you can easily justify because it's often for a large center grant or new collaborations or new faculty coming together. So oftentimes when we think we're asking for stuff for big audacious goals, we're asking for less than we should.
Okay. So, kind of along those lines, what are common mistakes faculty make when trying to negotiate? What have you seen, and what advice can you give on that?
I think some of the things that I've seen and some of the things I've done myself are to go in with the viewpoint of you owe me this and therefore I should get it. Even if you feel that way, it should never come across that way. And most of us don't really feel that way, I think. But that just sets a bad tone. It's manifested often in ways of you saying that you're special or that you're different, which often rubs department chairs the wrong way, understandably. So that's one thing. The other is not to go in prepared. So the one thing that the other party will want to know is what is it that you want? And you have to be able to say it. And sometimes it's hard because oftentimes we don't really fully know what it is that we want.
Mhm.
But you do have to be able to say what is the most meaningful thing to you and what it is that you can live without. You don't have to tell them that right away, but you should have a pretty idea in your mind.
Mhm.
The other thing is when a figure is thrown out for compensation, if you feel that it is very low, um, you should not let that show because that obviously doesn't move the needle then in any way. So some statements along the lines of, we're very far apart on what I was thinking this position is worth,
Mhm.
or I would love to do this, but here's what I'm thinking. Those kinds of statements just set the other person at ease. And it is often the case. I think this is also a gender issue sometimes that the offer is low to begin with. But if you let that sort of make you all defensive and such, then that shuts the conversation down.
Mhm.
So ignore what that number is. If it's very low, have the number that you have in your mind and say that we're very far apart. Here's what I was thinking, or something, similar. Those are all things that I've seen where people get upset and they walk away. And that I think is a mistake because you lose that opportunity. And then the last thing I would say is, which we don't see very much, but when it does happen, it takes people off guard, which is arrogance. Many people come in with great degrees or highly subspecialized or justifiably very proud of what they're able to do. You just can't let it show.
Mhm. Do you see that these kinds of mistakes are made by both men and women, or is it more gender predominant for one or the other?
So I think in the literature and also what we've observed is that when women go in, and this is, of course, a very big generalization, not everyone is like that. But in the literature, what's been reported is that when women go in, they're often apologetic for what they're asking. They're often timid. Um, And this is interesting because they're not usually timid or apologetic in their work or in other areas of their lives. But
Hmm.
somehow going in makes them want to be that way. And then when the answer is no, then they give up right away. And then the worst thing is that they often don't ask again because they've experienced what they perceive as to be such a clear rejection.
Hmm.
So those are the gender specific things. I think many men will go in with the idea that, again, just that confidence that I'm worth it, I deserve this, and if I don't ask it, I know I won't get it, so why shouldn't I ask for it? There is this thing called the tiara syndrome for women, which is the belief that if you put your head down and work hard, that somebody will notice you and put a tiara on your head and say, good job, and give you a raise. And that never happens. It just never, ever happens. So you do have to ask for it. But those are some gender things, and part of it is socialization over centuries. That
Hmm.
it's all about the community and other people, and when you're asking for something, it appears selfish. I
Hmm.
think we have to get over that, and many people have gotten over that.
Hmm.
But it's not just the people asking that have to get over that; it's also the other party,
Hmm.
because if they are used to women behaving in a certain way, when somebody comes in a little bit assertively and makes the ask, which you should do normally, the other party might also be taken aback because that hasn't been their experience. So these centuries of socialization will not go away quickly, but being aware of it and noticing it and trying to mitigate it is important.
I wanted to ask you, do you approach negotiations like when you're doing it, let's say with your division chief or department chair versus, let's say, higher senior leadership, such as a dean, versus like a peer? Do you have a different approach when you're thinking about who you're negotiating with? And can you describe that approach?
The most important thing for these things that I have found is that how much do you know the other person, and how much do you know about what drives them? So for instance, if I'm speaking with my division head, if I know that there's a gap in clinical coverage,
Hmm.
I'm going to be mindful of that when I'm going and asking for, say, time to write a grant or write a paper. You can still ask for it, but you have to make sure you address their needs as well.
Hmm.
And so knowing what the other person wants. So that's better done with your peers or with your immediate bosses and supervisors because you work closely with them. You might have a very good idea of what drives them. With senior leadership, like the dean, for instance, you might need to go in and ask for things without knowing anything about them,
Mm.
which is also, I would think, a mistake. Because even if you haven't encountered this particular situation with them, you should ask other people about their style and what you can expect. And that way you're better prepared for what they might say, regardless of, what it might be. It is rare for somebody when you go in and ask for something for them to say, oh, sure, yeah, it's yours for the asking. Here, take it. So being aware of how to make progress without shutting the conversation down for these things um, is what has helped me in these senior leadership. And then, of course, data. The more that you can have about what you've done, about what you will do, how that will help the institution is really critical. I'll give you an example. For the Associate Dean of Clinical Trials, the most important thing was to grow the revenue from the clinical trials. These were industry-sponsored trials, and we weren't invoicing the sponsor was one thing, but also we weren't having enough clinical trials come in, so there wasn't as much revenue being generated. So that's what you come in with, saying that you will grow the revenue. But what you need for that, in order to do that, is the kind of support that one would ask for, like a team of people to work with and people to invoice regularly and so on.
Mhm.
And so when you have that revenue, then you can go back and say, oh, I've done what I was, asked to do and what I said I would do. And in my view, what this means is X, Y, Z. How are you viewing it?
Mhm.
And then that starts sort of the next phase of, does this mean a raise for you? Does this mean, some other things, a bigger team, whatever it is that you think you need. And again, I typically don't go in thinking that it will be a yes right away. But what I want to learn from them is, what do they want to see? And once you have shown them what they said they wanted to see, then it's a bit hard for them to say no.
Can you provide an example or one or two examples of like a successful negotiation that you have done, and what are the common threads in that?
So I would say this associate dean for clinical trials position was
Mhm.
one that I would consider successful. It was successful because, well, one is that, I had expertise in the space, so I could be confident going in and I could share my goals and the metrics. And those metrics are very objective. So increase revenue by whatever, 30%, increase the number of clinical trials by 10%, just very data-driven aspects. And then the other thing I knew was that that was what the dean wanted,
Mhm.
but it wasn't explicitly said because you could make the case that you could grow clinical trials that are federally funded, which is also a very great thing to do. But that wasn't what was driving our dean. He wanted to see more industry sponsored clinical trials. So being able to speak to what was important to them, to the institution. Um, Madison is a bit of a biotech hub now. And so being able to take advantage of these startups and introduce them to clinical trials is really important to our dean and his sort of legacy and his portfolio. So that was successful in that sense. So going in with data, being confident in your skills, and then when I didn't get everything that I was asking for, which was the amount of time that I felt this needed, and the dean was like, well, it may need that much time down the road, but at the moment, this is a new position, so we can do 30%, for instance.
Mhm.
So the question then for me was, am I willing to do this for 30%, fully realizing that like most of us, our jobs are, more than 150% at any given time. So that's something that I was willing to do and then see what happened in the next few years and then go back. So what you want in the letter then is that this would be readdressed at a certain point in time when these metrics have been met and you reevaluate how much time it's taking and so on. I do think that with everyone's memories the way they are, and this is no malice on anyone's part, but you have to have it in writing because none of us can remember anything that we said, far less what anyone else said. And I would not expect the dean to remember these things. So now sometimes people balk at that. They'd be like, well, why do you want it in writing? And you can just say, it's for my own memory. I have a terrible memory, which is true. And I need to be able to refer to it and make sure I'm doing what you're asking me to do. So that is what was helpful to me. And many times it has been the case that people have forgotten and they've said, well, I don't know that we agreed to that. And I'm like, but it's in the letter. And then they're like, oh, yeah, it is in the letter. So that piece is really critical.
Can you gave an example of successful negotiations that you've had. Can you provide an example on the other side of something that was less successful that you tried to negotiate for, and what you learned from that, and what were the common threads there?
Well, I tried to negotiate a pay increase for my position as chief of VA research.
Mhm.
And that was not successful because, and it's really how one defines success. But in my case, um, I thought that I was doing an amazing job. And I thought I had demonstrated that I was doing that amazing job. But the answer was, um, this isn't something that we would really look at this point in time.
Mhm.
And my mistake was in not asking what the philosophy was for compensation and asking what they would need to see. And if the answer is something like, no matter what we see, this is our ceiling for this type of position, well, then right? And then you can figure out what that means for you, whether you seek a different opportunity or whether in the same place you seek a different position or something. But the mistake was going in with a specific number and not taking the time to figure out what the options were. And so down the road, as you, of course, think about it in hindsight, there are a number of ways where even if you don't get a raise, right, you could get a performance bonus. You could say in 2 years, this could be readdressed. You could do less of something um, and more of something else if you can't get the raise, for instance. All kinds of things are possible. But the mistake I made was going in very dogmatically and then not really seeing what else could be done.
Mhm. Do you find that maybe women or underrepresented minorities have more challenges when it comes to negotiations in the field of medicine and healthcare?
I think as a group, yes. I think, of course, there are many people who are skilled at it, but there are also many. And this is, this people are inherently, I think, rational in the way that they behave. So if they're having trouble, it's really twofold. One
Mhm.
is that they're being responded to in a way that is very stereotypical. And that's what I was mentioning, that the other party will often be taken aback. Well, why is this person asking in an assertive manner when all my impressions of women have been that they don't do that? So that cognitive dissonance that they experience. And that, of course, then reduces the self-efficacy on the part of the person who's asking for anything. And then that just sort of spirals downward from there. Now, this is a tricky thing to solve because it's for the leaders to recognize that they shouldn't be that way in those situations. But it is often a very hard thing. And that, I think, is why women and underrepresented minorities have trouble in some of these things. I mean, I've experienced it myself, and part of it was when you take these courses in negotiating, one of the things is that you are, rightfully so, you're assertive and you're confident and you go in and you ask for the things that you feel you deserve. Nothing wrong with any of that. But it is often perceived as being, and there's any number of words that have been applied to this, that you're being too aggressive, that you're not being likable, that you're not approaching it the way that people are used to seeing women approach things. And so that, I think, is a big challenge. And then there's also this whole phenomenon of, I don't know quite how to phrase it, but the feeling that women and underrepresented minorities should be grateful for whatever it is that is being offered, which is really, needs complete reframing. I mean, you can be grateful and still want what you are worth, and none of that is an either or thing. But it is often framed that way, and it is sometimes perceived that way, which is something that has to be fixed.
We have a question from the audience. Can you give tips on, you mentioned getting everything in writing. Can you mention tips on how to write these wrap up emails or letters after you've had that verbal discussion with the division chief or the chair to remind leadership of when to review or what had been agreed to so you don't come off rude or too much? Do you have tips on how to write that email or wording that you would recommend to use?
Yes, thank you for the question. I have seen some great examples of how people are wording their emails. Typically, they will start with a really positive statement about how excited they are, how they loved the meeting. They have some great ideas for how to make a difference in this position. So the first couple of statements are all about expressing enthusiasm. And then after that, you could phrase it something like, this is a summary of the action items and the steps that we agreed on. And then you just list them very succinctly. I wouldn't make it a long email, just the bullet points of what you want them to do. And then ask them, what would be a good time to circle back to get these to completion or to the next steps.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then if they need any other information, you'd be happy to supply it. And then if there is something that you can, it's good to instill a little bit of a sense of urgency. Most of us are urgent. There's something's always coming up. So you could honestly say that the reason that you would like to have this resolved by XYZ is so that you can move into this next phase of this job with great confidence and energy or whatever it is. So I think some sort of deadline that's a soft deadline, but puts a sense of urgency is important.
What skills can you learn from negotiating? Like, how does it help with faculty, like school of medicine faculty, with their long-term career growth? Like you've mentioned how sometimes you've had successful negotiations, not less successful. So what are different skills that you have learned from doing all these different types of negotiations?
I think the one important thing has been that realizing that ultimately it's not really a big deal in the sense that if you make negotiating sort of this big thing that you have to do, every few years or so, then it takes on an importance that it probably doesn't need to have. So since we do it in our daily lives all the time in little ways, the big stuff should also be viewed like that in our minds. which puts us in the mindset of not the overpowering fight or flight response every time we're confronted with it. So that is one thing. The more you do of it, the more it allows you to conquer yourself in terms of your emotions, in terms of your demeanor, in terms of how you respond. Not that there's anything wrong in whichever way your demeanor or response is, but as long as you're aware of it and you can control it, that is probably the most important skill. And then it comes in handy with other things like crucial conversations or things when you're having to say stuff to somebody that isn't necessarily, fun for either party. And in my role in research, I sometimes have to have these conversations about compliance with various things or about um, typically it's about adherence and compliance to policies and procedures. So you get better at doing that without getting adversarial. It's very matter of fact and very calm. So negotiation teaches you that. And then the other thing, I think it just opens your mind to possibilities. Oftentimes, when we go in the first few times, we've already set a limit around ourselves and put ourselves in this box that we think we belong in. But negotiations offers, there are no false choices. It gives you the possibility of, well, it doesn't have to be this or that. It can be this and that. And it can be also be a third thing that I hadn't even thought of. So the more you do, the more you realize that there are some really creative solutions to what you think you want that can be had in different ways.
Because I think a lot of us go in thinking about negotiations as like potentially conflict, but what you said is kind of more think about it as opportunities instead of a us versus them approach.
Exactly, exactly. We had a session a few years ago at our institution where people talked about that when they had on their calendar a one-on-one meeting with their boss, they would start dreading it a week ahead of time. And they would go in all sort of, make themselves small and have a demeanor that wasn't very enthusiastic. And the reframing of that is, how often do you get a one-on-one with your boss? This is an opportunity for them to see you at your best, most confident self. So if you go in excited, that's good for both parties.
Mm-hmm.
And letting your inner voice sort of derail you on that does not serve you. So you have to recognize it, acknowledge it, and then set it aside and really become enthusiastic about that. But that is, I think, the default for many people is to think about this as like, my gosh, I have to do this, as opposed to, I want to do this, so let's do this.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. I think that's really important. And I think we have two questions from the audience. One is, can you recommend either go to articles, websites, podcasts, books, or courses? I know a long list I said that you found very helpful in your negotiations journey.
Yeah, I can't think of the authors for all of these, but I can send them to you later on. But some of the
Okay.
books that come to mind are Women Don't Ask.
Yes.
Um, and then Getting to Yes, I think is a classic one. And then one that I've recently read is by, I do remember that guy's name, Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. That has also been helpful to me. I'm not a big one for podcasts, although I do listen to the life coaching school ones, and that's been helpful because
Mm-hmm.
of their model that, your thoughts drive your feelings and your feelings drive your actions. So if you find yourself feeling a certain way, try to figure out what is the thought that is driving this feeling. And in negotiation, it typically goes something like this. I don't think I'm going to win, so to speak, at this, and therefore I feel terrible about this, and therefore I won't go in and ask for it.
Mm.
So recognizing that thought can then reframe your entire response to it. But those are some of the ones that come to mind.
And what about any courses that you recommend from national societies, organizations, schools?
There is a good Harvard course on conflict management and negotiation. It's those two together,
Mm-hmm.
which I found very helpful. I think it was just like a 2.5 day course and it was virtual at the time. So that was good. Of course, ELAM offers resources
Mm-hmm.
for women on negotiating, also very helpful. And then many institutions, their offices of faculty development will have some resources, but I think it's so institution specific that you can look at it and read it, but it doesn't really, it's one data point, but it's not necessarily the only way to do it. AAMC for their early and mid-career
Mm-hmm.
faculty. leadership seminars will have negotiating.
Okay. We have another question from the audience is that as a mentor, can you advise regarding like institutions' expectations for someone with a half FTE versus full FTE when they're negotiating? Are, I think sometimes if someone is potentially working less than 100% on paper, at times, sometimes the culture could be felt like, well, you don't have the right to negotiate. So what is your thoughts about this and how should one approach it?
So for this is a tricky one because this is not uncommon in many places. And
Mm-hmm.
what might be some helpful tips would be to go in as a coalition,
Mm-hmm.
especially if the culture is such that you're disadvantaged just by virtue of being part-time. Um, so then going it with multiple people and making the case is one option. I think the other is to determine if there are written policies and procedures that are governing what you can and cannot be eligible for or
Mm-hmm.
ask for. Sometimes there's a lot of unwritten rules that get passed from person to person, but when you actually look at the documentation, it turns out you have more rights than you thought you had. So that written piece, reviewing that is really critical. Those are a couple of the things that come to mind. I do think this is a tricky one because there is often this sort of weird approach that people will take to part-time faculty,
Mm-hmm.
even while we're encouraging people to do that because of good work-life balance or whatever their reasons might be. Um, so again, I think expressing enthusiasm for why you're doing what you're doing, and you're probably going above and beyond in your part-time state, and then having the data to back that up. If you can get a senior advocate in the room with you, somebody who has less to lose, for instance, and who has credibility and influence, I think that is always a great thing. Which is another thing for the negotiating piece as well, is that women and underrepresented minorities will often lack a sponsor in the way that men will have. And the role of a sponsor in this case is really very simple. They talk about you when you're not in the room and they talk you up. And that puts you in a position of great strength then going up in the negotiating because the other party is already primed to believe that you are a superstar.
Mm-hmm.
Always nicer to have, somebody else praise you than you having to do that yourself. So that is another thing, seeking sponsorship in the place where you're at for these sorts of conversations.
And just for the group, can you explain the difference between mentorship and sponsorship?
Yeah, so mentorship is about, you're training someone to walk the path that you have walked, and you're guiding them in specific skills that they might need to have. So as a research mentor, I might be mentoring people on writing a grant or writing a good Ames page or doing other career or life advice, work-life balance, for instance. But for a sponsor, they typically don't need to do any of these things. They have to know you and they have to believe in you. And what they do typically is that behind the scenes, sometimes even without your knowledge, because they're in a position of influence, when an opportunity comes up, they'll put your name forward because they believe in your potential. Now, the important thing is here is that they have to know you because they are also putting themselves at a little bit of a risk by putting your name up. And so they must believe in you to want to do that. And that is where I think women are often not in those conversations to find a sponsor that will do that for them. And typically men have had that. I mean, how many times have we been in meetings in people who are very senior in their career and in positions of great influence, and you ask, well, what's your journey been? How did you get this position? And they're like, well, my friend called me up and said, do you want to do this job? And then here I am 20 years later. That sort of stuff does not happen for women. I can tell you that, at least not at this point.
So you mentioned a technique of bringing people into a coalition. There's a question from the group, from an audience member saying, recently, Mass General and Brigham primary care physicians recently filed to unionize. So, what are your thoughts about group negotiations?
I think it is a powerful approach. I think anytime you have the voice of a group, it is going to get more attention than the voice of an individual,
Mhm.
no matter what the issue, really. And especially if that group has some teeth, if things, for instance, don't fully, like there's no conversation happening, then they have something they can fall back on. Often with an individual faculty member, it's difficult even to get an audience with the decision maker. but you don't face that same challenge when you're going in as a group. So yes, I think it is a powerful strategy.
So I think we have one last question from our group is earlier you mentioned it's important to realize potentially the things that you've left on the table during your negotiation unknowingly. Any tips on, I mean, you mentioned a lot of doing your homework, getting the data, any other tips on about how to find out what one could ask for? Sometimes we just don't know, so we don't ask. So we didn't
Yeah.
we left it
Mhm.
on the table. So is there another way to find out? I think you mentioned sponsorship is one way. Any other tips?
So, yes, so I think one would be to look at other disciplines outside of medicine. Business is a good example. Obviously, the two cultures are very different, but at least gives you an idea of the types of things that people can ask for. And to recognize also that it's not just for yourself that you can ask, it's also for other members of your group, which can help you as well. So, an example of that is that, say when you're asking for startup funding for research, you also ask for a scientist, that somebody that will report to you, and you ask for them to have their salary paid for 3 hours, which is not, or 3 years, which is not coming out of your startup, but it's something that you can, take great advantage of, and it will help advantage this other individual too. So those are the things that, when you're making a list, I think it's helpful to have a running list. As you evolve in your career, you will find that you can ask more for some things that you can't as a junior faculty member. So if you have a running list and you add to that every time you hear of something new that somebody successfully asked for, or you read about something that you felt could be of use to you, and then when the time comes and you don't have to think about it, it's already there. These are the types of things that I will often ask when there are visiting professors coming to our institution, or when there's somebody doing grand rounds and I'm meeting with them afterwards. That's the best situation to ask about these candid questions, because they're not from your institution. And so they can give you ideas about what worked for them or what worked for them. So that is one thing. The other framework I use is called the SEEPS framework, which is only loosely relevant here. It's called the Systems Engineering Initiative for Patient Safety, but it can be applied to anything. And so it has 5 things in it. It has tools, tasks, technology, people, and organization. Those are the 5. And in each of these, you can think about what are the things that I can ask for. So for instance, is there a certain system, certain software, certain equipment, and the tools and technologies in the tasks? So there are certain things that you aren't doing that you want to be doing, like leading a seminar series, or whatever it is that speaks to you, starting up a new clinical program. On the organization side, it's what sort of leadership activity or presence do you envision for yourself? I do warn people about titles that are not coming with any resources. Titles have a role to play, but you don't just want the title. You also want the structure and the resources around it. And then people could be people in your group, whether if you're a single faculty in a certain subspecialty, how do you negotiate to have that group be made bigger, or trainees or research scientists? So depending upon your sphere of work, there's always people that can be negotiated as well.
Well, I think if we've had a great conversation with you, Dr. Safdar. We've had wonderful questions from the audience. And so I don't know if you have any parting tips or advice that you wish you had known when you were just starting out in your career that you wish someone had told you, if you'd like to share with the group before we end this session.
I think the biggest learning point for me has been to set the fear aside,
Mhm.
acknowledge it, and really just set it aside. I think if I had known that early on in my career, that would have been very helpful to me.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all the faculty who have joined today. We really appreciate Dr. Safdar for taking time out of your busy schedule to join and have this conversation with us. Thank you to all the faculty for attending monthly on Mondays. We've already emailed everybody the monthly on Mondays series for 2025. So please do join us. We hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you at the next one in January. Thank you.